Tonight, the Texas House approves a spending plan, the winners and losers of their multi-billion-dollar budget, plus a new way of looking at Texas border policies.
All that we're doing is jailing the problem away.
One Texas congressman is joining the fight to decriminalize illegal border crossings. And later, anti-Semitism on the rise in Texas, what some experts say is the driving force behind the spike in recent incidents. Capitol Tonight starts right now.
There've been 136 ayes in 10 days. House Bill 1 is finally passed.
After a marathon debate Thursday, the Texas House approved an historic $302 billion spending plan for the next 2 years. Thanks for joining us here on Capitol Tonight. I'm Karina Clay. Here's some of what's included in the proposal. $17.5 billion for property tax cuts, nearly $5 billion for border security, and $5 billion in new money for public schools. One of the biggest debates of the day was over so-called school choice. A bipartisan coalition of House members voted to ban state funds going to private school vouchers. The bill does now head to the Senate, where lawmakers have been crafting their own version of the spending plan. Senators also just approved a voucher-like proposal in that chamber. We want to bring in our reporter roundtable now with two people who were there for the budget debate. Bob Garrett is the Austin bureau chief for the Dallas Morning News, and Nikki Griswold is with the Austin American-Statesman. Good to see you both.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bob, I mean, relatively short budget debate, historically speaking. I think we were talking about this before we went on camera, but what were the biggest surprises for you?
Well, the duration of just 10 hours, Karina. Some of us had several meals packed in our backpacks. You know, one of the big surprises you have to, if you step back, is how they are not spending all the money they have. They're still, you know, leaving a lot on the side. And of course, we could see some more of it spent, especially if they craft those constitutional amendments that get it out from under the spending cap that Dan Patrick has been talking about since late November. I think the other big surprise everyone was really keyed, focused in on was the voucher thing, just to see whether there was still, you know, a majority that would stand up against Greg Abbott, Dan Patrick, and there was.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you're talking about the $33 billion surplus that the lawmakers are working with. I mean, Nikki, the House voting to ban state funds going to vouchers. I mean, we've seen this before in the House, but there's been such a push this session, and we've seen that, as Bob mentioned, from the governor, the lieutenant governor. I mean, does this mean it's just dead? Where does it go from here?
I think given how much pressure the governor is putting on lawmakers to get this across the finish line, I don't think it's necessarily dead at this point. I think nothing's quite dead until they gavel out at the end of May. But I think it does add an interesting touch to the debates next week in the House, where they'll be talking about these school choice bills in the Public Education Committee.
Yeah, Bob, I mean, how do you see that conversation going? Obviously, as mentioned, the Senate passed its voucher-like proposal, and then kind of just trying to move forward on this with such a signal from this bipartisan coalition in the House against vouchers.
Yes, we should say the governor put out a statement shortly before we came in today that's saying, hey, you know, we did great. It was 115 votes for that prohibition last session, and we're down to 85. So that's about where some smart people had expected that to be a month or two ago. And we'll see whether their expectation that this bill would die in House Calendars Committee bears out. The thing you saw in the Senate that I thought was interesting was this tension between universal vouchers, which was rejected initially by Dan Patrick and Brandon Creighton, to just be those who are in the public schools that go to private schools, and they had to open it up a little bit to low-income people in private schools, which isn't that many people can afford private school, but they're going to spend some money on that. But the right was divided over how to craft this, and I don't know how that's all shaking out and whether it affects what happens in the House.
Yeah, I mean, an interesting thing we'll obviously all continue to watch. Nikki, I did want to ask, because there was a big push by Democrats to increase teacher pay raises, and we heard some new information really during the debate from one of the Republican lawmakers who's pushing some of these teacher pay raise bills, and I think he said he's going to bring them forward next week. So some things that we were learning, but what are you anticipating? I mean, obviously given the budget surplus, but just this push by Democrats to pump more money into teacher pay raises. Do you see that getting done?
I think the Republicans would argue that, they are working to get teachers a significant raise this legislative session. It just likely won't be as much as Democrats want to see. And, I think Democrats argue that teachers, or what the Republicans are proposing, really just keeps up with inflation rather than providing an even more meaningful raise. So I think we'll have to see how much Democrats are able to get that number inching higher before the end of session.
Yeah, and we've seen kind of the split even between the House and the Senate on that as well. Bob, House members also approving a $14 billion emergency budget, spends billions more on school safety. And the one thing I wanted to ask you about was for retired teachers. How historic is that bump for retired teachers? It's their cost of living, the pension there.
Yeah, we've, in some sessions when we were flush in the last decade or so, we'd give them a 13th check. We couldn't do the COLA because of actuarial soundness. We had to pour billions into it. Well, actually, we're going to put $3.5 billion if the House has its way. It's, I think, higher than the Senate at this point, which would allow, depending on when you retired, 2%, 4%, 6% bump plus a one-time supplement of $5,000 to those over 70. The Senate has slightly different numbers, but it's going to be a big deal for retired teachers who really, in some circumstances, are living hand to mouth.
Yeah, for sure. Nikki, Bob, thank you. Go get some rest. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
As mentioned, the House budget includes nearly $5 billion for border security efforts in Texas. This comes at a time when Republicans in Congress and across the nation are clamoring for restrictions to dramatically reduce the flow of migrants trying to cross the border. But some progressive Democrats in Washington, including a lawmaker from Texas, are proposing legislation to decriminalize illegal border crossings. Our Washington reporter Rena Diamante has the story.
Carolina Canizales' fear of deportation was persistent growing up as an undocumented immigrant in San Antonio.
My friends would get in trouble at school. A school resource officer would come, but then somehow my friends would end up in ICE custody.
Seeing how undocumented immigrants were treated inspired her to advocate on their behalf. Her group, the Immigrant Legal Resource Center, supports the New Way Forward Act in Congress. The legislation would, in part, end the mandatory detention of some migrants crossing the border, make it easier for some people to obtain asylum, and block state and local police from arresting and detaining undocumented immigrants.
We need federal legislation that untangles the criminal legal system and the immigrant legal system. They damage way too many people, and it's way too expensive to operate it when it's colluded. And the prime example of that is Texas.
It's a reference to Operation Lone Star, Texas Governor Greg Abbott's multi-billion-dollar program deploying state law enforcement officers to stop migrants and illegal drugs from crossing the border. Some state lawmakers want to create a border protection unit, specifically to arrest anyone crossing the border into Texas illegally. A Democratic congressman from Texas, who is co-sponsoring the New Way Forward Act, says the legislation would counter such state efforts.
Our local police departments, they should be focused on keeping us safe. They should be working on backlogs of rape kits. They should be looking after our communities against violent offenders. They shouldn't be used to go hunt down innocent immigrant families.
The bill has little chance of advancing, but for some progressive Democrats, it sends a signal they'll push back against the more restrictive proposals being seriously considered by the Biden administration, as well as a separate measure backed by Texas Republicans that would turn away migrants at the border if the government can't detain them.
When there are people still fleeing for their lives from lots of countries where there's real turmoil, the idea that we would end asylum laws as we know them right now is just wrong.
As for Canizales, she said she believes people should not be punished for trying to seek a better life. In Washington, Rena Diamante, Capitol Tonight.
And for more on this, earlier this week I spoke with Denise Gilman. She's the director of the Immigration Law Clinic at the University of Texas at Austin. Here's her take on these competing border plans in Congress.
At the national congressional level, we're seeing once again the recognition by at least some that we must do something to regularize young people who've been in this country for many years, to otherwise regularize those who are living in the shadows. And at the same time, we see another side of it, which is just increased, ramped up enforcement at the border with no real plan for addressing the needs of those who are already in the United States. And I don't see much prospect for real change.
Governor Abbott touts how successful Operation Lone Star has been, that he's filling in the gaps that the Biden administration is failing to do. I mean, how effective do you think it's been? Have you seen it be in terms of stopping the flow of illegal immigration that he's trying to do?
Right. So, I mean, I guess that's always the question is, what does it mean to be effective? I mean, it certainly has had an incredibly huge and quite awful impact on asylum seekers crossing into the United States seeking protection, who then end up in a parallel justice system in prisons under the state's authority instead of being processed under the immigration laws. So there's definitely a very significant impact. Has it stopped arrivals of people fleeing dangerous situations in their home countries? No. And it really can't be expected to. Once again, this idea that we can somehow deter migration when we have really serious human rights situations in home countries, it just doesn't bear out. People flee a burning house because they have to flee a burning house, and they're not taking into account exactly what new measure is going to be in place at the U.S. border when they get here.
Well, and the Texas House now wants to take it one step further. I mean, what's your take on the push there to create a state border protection unit which would allow trained volunteers to make arrests?
I mean, it's almost even hard to describe all of the legal problems that exist with a bill like this one. So I'll just note that it would be a completely unprecedented way of having the state take on authority that really belongs to the federal government in immigration issues. And that's for good reason. We don't want every state in the country to have a different immigration policy, because that involves foreign affairs and it involves international and national considerations. So it certainly is problematic in that sense. And then, of course, just the message that it sends of xenophobia, of rejecting migrants, no matter what their circumstances, no matter what our labor needs are, that leads to an invitation to have them come. And so it's certainly going to be problematic. Even the very proposal itself, even if not enacted into law, sends a really negative message.
Still to come on Capitol tonight, Justice Clarence Thomas speaks out how he's responding to backlash over a report he accepted gifts from a major GOP donor from Texas. Plus, anti-Semitic hate crimes are on the rise in the state, where the state ranks and what's being done to try to stop such incidents. Welcome back. Let's get a check now of some of the other political stories making headlines across Texas. Texas Republican Congressman Tony Gonzalez is tapping into his campaign war chest to oppose progressive measures proposed by big cities in his district. He's targeting a proposition in San Antonio that would decriminalize marijuana and abortion and implement some police reform policies. He's also opposing one in El Paso that would take steps to fight climate change. This comes weeks after he was censured by the Texas GOP for voting with Democrats on same-sex marriage and guns. The Texas Senate's proposed raise for public school teachers would benefit wealthy districts more than urban districts burdened by teacher retention. All teachers would qualify for a $2,000 raise, but teachers in districts with fewer than 20,000 students would qualify for $6,000. The bill's author said it was meant to help small rural districts, but it also benefits wealthy mid-sized districts. And Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is responding to criticism he did not disclose free trips he accepted from a wealthy Texas GOP donor. He said Harlan Crow and his wife Kathy are close friends, and that his colleagues and others in the federal judiciary told him trips with friends who did not have business before the court did not have to be reported. Federal judges are required to submit an annual financial disclosure that includes gifts but does not require them to list hospitality from close friends. The man accused of intentionally starting a fire at an Austin synagogue 2 years ago pleaded guilty this week. This includes federal hate crime charges. He faces up to 20 years in prison and waived his right to an appeal. The man set Congregation Beth Israel on fire on Halloween night in 2021. Police later found anti-Semitic journal entries leading up to the arson. According to the Anti-Defamation League, incidents like this are on the rise in Texas. The state had a record 211 incidents last year. Texas now ranks 5th in the country for this type of hate. The majority of incidents reported in Texas in 2022 were either vandalism or harassment tied to white supremacist propaganda. Nationally, the number of anti-Semitic incidents last year was the highest since the Jewish advocacy group began keeping track in 1979. Earlier this week, I spoke with Jackie Nierenberg. She's the regional director for the ADL Austin region. I asked her why these incidents are on the rise.
Well, you know, it's really hard to pinpoint one single reason why these incidents are on the rise, but there are several trends that seem to be contributing. The emboldening of extremists and hate groups in political discourse, for example, the growing acceptance of anti-Semitism in mainstream pop culture, and also the rise in online hate content. All of that came together to probably result in these high numbers this year.
Jackie, Texas, as mentioned, ranks 5th nationally. We've got a list of where some of the other states above us rank. I mean, why do you think Texas ranks so high? And are you surprised by these rankings in terms of the other New York, California, New Jersey, and Florida?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to use a phrase that's used quite often these days, and that is, it's shocking but not surprising. So Texas, because of its sheer population and the fact that it has large universities, those two things make it a much more likely place for this kind of activity to take place. And Texas is also home to one of the larger extremist organizations, so there's going to be more activity just because of that as well.
What specific incidents can you point to of anti-Semitism here in Texas? I know a lot of people will be reminded of the hostage situation last year at Beth Israel Synagogue in Colleyville. That's a big one that comes to mind. I mean, what else are we talking?
Well, for the most part, we're talking about vandalism and harassment in the form of flyering. A lot of people report that they receive flyers on their driveways. They're often included in a little baggie with some pebbles in it to weigh it down. And what's interesting is that these groups know how to sort of get right up to the line of what's legal to spread their hateful rhetoric. When they do that kind of flyering on people's driveways, for example, it's not anything more than littering, unless they can be caught trespassing. So flyering is the most common kind of harassment we see in Texas, and certainly in the Central Texas region.
Yeah, I'm rising to the level of the hostage situation and different things like that, I'm sure, as you're tracking this. We just have about a minute left, but what is needed to try to fight these kinds of acts of anti-Semitism? I mean, what is the ADL doing? What are others doing to try to combat this?
So we work with law enforcement partners all over the country at the federal, state, and local levels to keep them informed of what we know and exchange information with them. We also advocate. We work with our legislatures at the state level and also at the national level to promote legislation that is that helps with anti-bias education, for example, Holocaust education, which ties directly to this kind of behavior and why we all need to be vigilant. This can happen to any group, and so we all need to be there for each other as allies. So if people hear some kind of rhetoric, even if it's the most innocent or unintentional kind of anti-Semitic rhetoric using a trope, we encourage people to, call it out. And the easiest way to do that is just to ask a question, like, why are you saying that? Or what exactly does that mean? And that kind of takes down the tone of the rhetoric, and it also allows somebody to answer the question without feeling attacked. So.
And still to come on Capitol Tonight. How how the White House is responding after the Tennessee state legislature voted to expel 2 of its members. Welcome back. The White House is responding to the expulsion of 2 black state lawmakers in Tennessee. Vice President Kamala Harris made a last-minute trip to Nashville today to meet with all Democratic state lawmakers there. The Republican-controlled state house claimed 3 lawmakers violated the chamber's rules by participating in a gun safety reform protest last week. Only one of them was allowed to keep her seat. President Joe Biden also condemned the expulsions, calling them shocking. Turning to the latest jobs report, there's been a bit of a labor market cool down. According to a new report, the U.S. economy fell below expectations when it came to job growth in March. Julia Benbrook is in Washington with more on how experts believe the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes may finally be having an effect on the labor market.
The March jobs report shows growth, but less than expected, with 236,000 jobs added. That's down from 326,000 added in February. The unemployment rate ticked up slightly to 3.5%. But with inflation still a big concern, the White House says this is actually a healthy level of growth.
I have thought of this really as the Goldilocks economy. It's not too hot, not too cold. It is really hitting that sweet spot that we've been looking for. We're continuing to add jobs, but it's at a more sustainable pace that we can continue to be at over the medium to longer term.
This report comes as the Biden administration and House Republicans struggle to come up with an agreement on the debt limit. While both sides say they won't default on what the nation owes, they disagree on whether to tie the increase to other budget decisions. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy continues to push for spending cuts, but the White House says the debt limit should be raised without other considerations, given the economic impact of not getting it done.
There are very grave concerns about what would happen if we took this historic step and did not address the debt ceiling limit. You know, Congress has repeatedly voted to increase the debt ceiling under both kinds of administrations, Republican and Democrat.
This is the first jobs report to come out since former Labor Secretary Marty Walsh left the position to run the NHL Players Association. President Joe Biden's nominee to step into that role is Julie Su, a former California labor official and current Deputy Labor Secretary.
Sue was confirmed as Deputy Labor Secretary in a party line vote. Her confirmation process to lead the department is expected to start later this month. She'll again need the support of almost every Democrat in the Senate in order to get a simple majority. If confirmed, she'll be the first Asian American secretary in Biden's cabinet. In Washington, Julia Benbrook, Capitol Tonight.
And that is going to do it for this edition of Capitol Tonight. We are back on Monday with the latest in Texas politics. Until then, thanks for watching. Stay safe and have a great weekend.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. For more refreshing stories about your community, click the subscribe button over here. You can also download our Spectrum News app and tune in to Channel 55 on Dish and DirecTV to get live news coverage, weather updates every 10 minutes, and more. We'll see you then.